What's up, design family, and welcome back to another episode of Fittdesign TV. So glad to have you back on the channel. On today's episode, we'll be looking at some common fabric usage requirements for sportswear items. Calculating the amount of fabric that you need for your collection can be a daunting task. Where do you begin and how do you calculate how much each garment needs? This video will take you through the main sportswear garment types and will outline, based on your roll size, how much fabric you should be purchasing. This should allow you to create an order that will fit the quantities that you're looking for, and at the same time, it should give you a clear idea of how much of a budget to allocate towards your fabric requirements. We'll also be looking at some special cases. So what are some cases that are going to extend or add on to your fabric requirements, or one of the ways to optimize your fabrics? This video is a quick how-to guide on your fabric usage requirements. Hey guys, and welcome to Fittdesign TV. So glad to have you here. On this channel, we discuss all things sports fashion, graphic design, manufacturing, and technology. We'll discuss key topics, answer pressing questions, and provide actionable steps on starting your own product line. If you're interested in any of the above topics, stick around. You're in for a good one. Understanding the fabric usage requirements per product type for your collection is essential when it comes to formulating a clear and concise budget that's not going to have you go overboard, but at the same time is not going to find you on the back foot where you don't have enough fabrics to continue your collection. The last thing you want to do is to order a certain quantity, to have it dyed, delivered to your cotton sew factory, and ultimately find out that you don't have enough fabric to continue your collection. At the same time, you don't want to over purchase and have excess fabric left over that you have no use for. So we're going to look at some key sportswear items, and we're going to consider traditional fabric roll sizes. Because as we know, and as anyone who's gone into a fabric shop knows, fabric rolls typically come in standardized sizes when it comes to their width. And then you have your roll. So we'll be calculating them according to the width of the roll and then the linear length that we're going to be using. So when it comes to calculation, I'll reiterate, we'll look at the different roll widths. For example, you have a roll width of 50 inches versus 60 inches. You're going to be able to make more garments per linear yard or meter of a 60-inch roll than a 50-inch roll. That's just common sense. So when it comes to calculating your linear requirements, you're going to have to consider the width of the roll. We'll look at the main standardized sizes, and I'll give you guys the linear requirements per garment type for each roll width. Starting off, we'll consider 5 key widths when it comes to our roll widths. We'll look at first 35 to 36 inches. That's typically your smallest width. Then we'll look at around 44 to 46 inches in width for the roll size. And then we'll look at around 50 inches, which is quite common. Then we'll look at 52 to 54 inches. And lastly, we'll look at the largest available sizes, usually that are 58 to 60 inches. I'll be mentioning everything in inches and yards for the purpose of this video, but we'll be providing the conversions down in the screen below so you guys can follow along. In terms of the key sportswear garment types that we'll be looking at, we'll be considering both men's and women's combined. Obviously, there will be a little bit of a difference because men's sizes are typically larger than women's sizes. But for the sake of this video, we will combine them. We'll provide an average for both. We'll consider the key garment types that are pants or joggers. We'll look at shorts, so activewear shorts. We'll also look at a sports bra. We'll look at a leggings, which we'll actually put in the pants category. It may require a little bit less than a traditional jogger, just because the pattern size is typically smaller. We'll look at long sleeve t-shirts. We'll look at short sleeve t-shirts. And lastly, we'll look at hoodies. So hoodies are going to require the most fabric out of the upper part of the collection. Starting off with the pants segment of this tutorial, we'll look at the requirements for a 35 to 36 inch roll width. Here we're looking at around 3¼ yards per garment. So when you lay out the patterns required to create that garment, all those patterns combined will consume the linear width or the linear length of one garment. So one garment will require approximately 3¼ yards of that roll width. And as I mentioned, it makes sense that as that roll gets wider, you're able to fit more patterns per linear yard. So we'll get onto that later, and you'll see a trend where as we get wider, we need less linear yards, but wider rolls are typically more expensive. So that's why this video will take you through the different widths. Next, for pants, we'll also look at 44 to 46 inches. Here, we're going down to around 2½ yards. So 2½ linear yards of 44 to 46 inch roll widths to create a pant garment. Next, we'll look at 50 inches. So again, this is one of the most common ones. Here, we're getting around 2½, again, 2½, because you'll notice here that the ways in which we can lay out our patterns on these pieces. So if you have your patterns and you lay them out traditionally or you lay them out strategically on your pattern roll, there's only so much you'll be able to fit within a certain width. So here we're also looking at around 2½ yards. Next, we have 52 to 54. Here we drop down to 2¼ yards. And then lastly, we have 58 to 60. So this is your widest roll, and here we're fitting around, again, 2¼ to 2 yards. Next, we'll look at shorts. Shorts are obviously going to require less fabric per garment just because there's less fabric going on. So when it comes to one short production, if we're looking at 35 to 36 inch roll widths, we're typically getting around 2½ yards. So if you compare that to the pants, where we're getting 3¼ yards, you see where the lesser amount of fabric is requiring us to consume less of the roll. Therefore, that typically makes sense that a short will cost less, because part of the cost of a garment is definitely baked into the fabric consumption. So the more fabric you have, traditionally the higher your fabric cost or your production cost is going to be on that garment. So shorts are typically going to be cheaper. That's why you notice things like sports bras, they may be intricate, but they are a bit more cost efficient than a pair of leggings, just because they're using so much less fabric. Next, we have 44 to 46 inches for the roll width. And how many linear yards are we going to consume for a sports bra? Well, for shorts, we're going to be consuming approximately 2⅛, approximately 2 yards, depending on the pattern that we're using. Next, we have 50 inches. Here, we'll be consuming around 1⅞ of a yard. And going on, we have 52 to 54 inches, and at that point, we'll be consuming approximately 1⅔ of a yard. And then lastly, we have 58 to 60 inches, which again is our largest roll size, and here we're consuming 1⅛ yard. So again, compare that to the jogger and notice how the fabric consumption definitely goes down, and that makes sense. You'll notice that trend across the different products that we have. Next, we'll look at a sports bra. With a sports bra, this is going to require the least amount of fabric just because of how small the pattern pieces is. Continuing on from the trend that we had before, we'll look at 35 to 36 inches, and that will require approximately 2 yards for a sports bra. Next, we'll look at 44 to 46 inches, and that will require 1⅛ of a yard. Going on, we'll look at 50 inches, and that will require approximately 1½ yard. So again, our trend is getting smaller. Then we have 52 to 54 inches, and that will require approximately 1⅔ of a yard. And lastly, we have 58 to 60 inches, and that will require approximately 1¼ yards. So let's do a small calculation here. Assuming that I have a roll of polyester spandex material at 36 inches in width, how much linear yards will I need to order of that garment or of that fabric in order to create 100 sports bras? If I know that I'm getting 1 sports bra for every 2 linear yards and I need 100, what you're gonna do is you're gonna multiply 2 linear yards by the quantity that you need. So if I need 100 garments, then I need to multiply 100 by 2 and I get 200 linear yards. So I'll need to order 200 linear yards of that fabric. And if that fabric costs $2 per linear yard, then I'm paying $400 in total for my sports bra production when it comes to our 100 run of that production style. So hope that makes sense, because every single fabric that you'll come across will be priced per linear unit. Moving on, we're going to be looking at one of the most common garment types that you're likely to encounter when creating a sportswear collection, and that's a short sleeve performance tee. If you're going for a 35 to 36 inch width roll, you're going to be consuming approximately 2 linear yards of that roll per one garment. If you're looking at 44 to 46 inches, you'll be consuming approximately 1 3/8 of a yard. If you're going for 50 inches, you'll be consuming 1.5 yards. If you're going for approximately a 52 to 54 inches, you'll be looking at 1 1/4. And then if you're going for 58 to 60 inches, you'll be consuming approximately again 1 1/4 or 1 yards per garment. Now, if we look at the long sleeve variant of that same garment, it's typically understandable that you will require more fabric or more linear yards of that fabric per garment type. So if we need a long sleeve version of that same t-shirt, when we're looking at 35 to 36 inches, we're going to be consuming approximately 2.5 instead of 2. So you see where that extra material is going, it's going to the sleeves. If we're going for 44 to 46 inches, we'll be consuming approximately 2 1/8 of a yard. If we're going for 50 inches, we'll be consuming approximately 1 3/4 of a yard. And if we're going for 52 to 54 inches, we'll be consuming approximately 1 3/4 of a yard. And lastly, if we're going for 58 to 60 inches, we'll be consuming, again, 1 3/8 or 1 1/4 of a yard. And last but not least, we'll be looking at hoodies. Logically, these are going to consume the most fabric out of the upper styles of production. So when it comes to long sleeve, short sleeve, sports bra, a hoodie is going to consume the most. So going with the smallest width roll, we have 35 to 36 inches. We're looking at consuming approximately 4 1/8 of a yard. If we're going 44 to 46 inches, we're going to be consuming approximately 3 1/8 of a yard. And if we're going for 50 inches, we'll be consuming approximately 2 3/4 of a yard. And if we're going for 52 to 54 inches, we're going to be consuming approximately 2 3/8 of a yard. And if we're going for 58 to 60 inches, we'll be consuming 2 1/4 to 2 linear yards per garment. It's important to note that the fabric requirements per product type are going to differ also depending on the specific style. For example, if you have a pullover hoodie that's more of an oversized fit, you're going to be using more fabric just because you need more fabric to create that fit. If you're going for something that's more of a compression fit, chances are you're going to be using less fabric. So do bear that in mind and understand that these are just guidelines. They're not the be all end all, and you need to also look at your specific situation. But hopefully you can see a trend that makes sense, and it gives you a clear idea of how you can calculate your fabric cost per unit. We looked at it in a sports bra when it comes to our fabric cost per linear yard, and then we looked at how many linear yards we'd need for a production of 100, and that formula can be applied towards any of the garment types that we mentioned in this video. So what are some ways that we can optimize our fabric consumption, and what are some things that we're going to do that may cause us to consume more fabric? Well, we'll also look at that right now. One great way to optimize our fabric production or our fabric consumption in a production run is to mix sizes. So look at it this way: if you've ever baked cookies, right? You have your dough and you're essentially cutting out cookies from your dough, right? You need to make sure that your cookies are laid out in a way that is the most efficient method possible for getting the maximum amount of cookies per your dough tray, whatever it's called. Same thing with garments. You have your fabric roll and you lay out your patterns in a way that optimizes their use. So when we mix sizes, we can actually optimize the spaces between each pattern piece to fill up the most amount of space so that we're wasting as little fabric as possible. So mixing sizes is a great way to optimize and to up the efficiency of your fabric consumption. Now, there are also requirements that limit the ways that in which we can be efficient with our fabric requirements. So we mentioned mixing sizes, that's great, but what happens when you need to follow a certain grain line? And this is a common problem when it comes to cutting fabrics on a pattern piece. The grain line is the direction of the warp yarns when it comes to our knit or our weave. So if we want to follow a certain grain line, whether it's a going along with the grain line or cross grain line or even a bias, which I'll mention in a bit, you need to make sure that you follow the grain line consistently. Typically, pattern makers will draw out the grain line using an arrow. That's how they'll demarcate it, and this will give them an idea of how to lay out their patterns. You can't lay out one pattern where it's cross grain line and then one pattern where it's going with the grain line. That doesn't make sense and actually leads to a very badly constructed garment. One of the hallmarks of poor quality clothing is check the grain lines. If they don't match, if they're not consistent, chances are that's poor quality production. So in that case, cutting across a certain grain line makes it almost impossible to fit certain shapes into the excess spaces that we have simply because that pattern piece fits. If it doesn't follow the grain line, you can't fit into that space. So you end up with wasted fabric. One of the other ways in which we can consume more fabric than initially expected is when creating patterns. So we have our cut patterns, but we also have our graphic patterns. Let's just take a pattern print legging for example. This is going to feature a seamless or a tiled pattern print across the garment. If we need to match up those seams or those patterns across certain seam lines, we need to make sure that we are aligning our pattern pieces correctly. Any misalignment can lead to issues when constructing the finished garment piece together. So needing to follow certain arrangements because of patterns is also a way that we use less of an optimal way of laying out our pattern pieces. So do bear that in mind. If you have graphic patterns in your production, chances are you're going to be using more fabric than if you just had a block or a solid color. Lastly, when it comes to production methods that can raise your fabric consumption expectations, or if you're cutting along the bias. So what does it mean to cut a garment along a bias? Cutting along a bias is basically going 45 degrees across the grain line. And why would someone do that? Well, one is it gives stronger edges because of the ways it's cut. So the raw edges actually hold their shape better. Typically the fabric tends to be lighter, it has more stretch, and it's just more pliable, it flows better. So a lot of higher end garments are cut along bias, and this is a very desirable trait. But the fabric efficiency is a lot less, so these garment costs are going to be higher. So do bear in mind that if you're cutting along bias because of any given reason, you're going to have higher linear yard requirements than cutting cross grain or along the grain. So that's pretty much it. That's a wrap, guys. If you guys enjoyed this video and found it informative, please smash the thumbs up button. It helps tremendously, helps us spread the word and share the knowledge with you good people. And if you guys want to see more videos like this, I felt like this was a quite technical video, something that I've often wondered and I've researched but couldn't find too much information. Let us know what types of videos you want to see in the comments below. And until next time, thank you guys so much for tuning into Fittdesign TV. Stay awesome.